Standing in the ruins of an ancient city, you might notice something unexpected. The walls aren't built to keep out armies, but to hold back something far more relentless: water. These cities weren't designed for battles. They were engineered to survive floods, to dance with the rhythms of rivers and storms. It's a revelation that changes everything we think about ancient urban planning. Forget fortresses and siege defenses. The real challenge was staying dry. Across millennia, civilizations from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley poured their ingenuity into creating cities that could withstand nature's wrath, and their solutions were nothing short of genius. Think about the last time you saw a flood, maybe on the news or even in your own neighborhood. Water is unstoppable. It seeps, it surges, it destroys. Now imagine trying to outsmart it without modern pumps or concrete barriers. That's exactly what ancient engineers did, and their legacy is etched into the very bones of these cities. Raised platforms, intricate drainage systems, even entire neighborhoods built on artificial hills, all to keep the water at bay. This wasn't just practical, it was a matter of survival. A single flood could wipe out years of progress, so they built with water in mind, not war. What's even more fascinating is how these ancient solutions still influence us today. The same principles that kept Mohenjo-Daro dry 4,000 years ago are echoed in modern flood-resistant architecture. There's a quiet brilliance in these designs, a wisdom that speaks across time. So as we journey through these ancient streets, we're not just uncovering lost technology, we're rediscovering a mindset, a way of thinking that prioritized harmony with nature over dominance. And by the end of this video, you'll never look at an old wall or a winding alley the same way again. Because sometimes the greatest defenses aren't against invaders, they're against the elements. The great rivers of the ancient world, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Nile, the Indus, were both givers and takers of life. They deposited rich silt that fed crops, creating the agricultural surplus that allowed cities to flourish. But when those same rivers swelled beyond their banks, they could erase everything in their path. This push and pull between abundance and destruction forced early societies to become masters of water before they could master anything else. We call them hydraulic civilizations for a reason. Their survival depended on controlling the flow. Take Mesopotamia, where the world's first cities rose from the floodplains. The Sumerians didn't just build walls, they dug canals, raised temple platforms like artificial mountains, and designed entire districts to slope gently away from the river. Their ziggurats weren't just religious symbols, they were elevated sanctuaries, high ground for when the waters came. And when you walk the ruins of Ur or Uruk today, you can still see the subtle grading of streets, the way bricks were laid to channel water rather than trap it. This wasn't an afterthought, it was the blueprint. Over in the Indus Valley, engineers took it even further. Mohenjo-Daro's streets were laid out in precise grids, but look closer. Every intersection had covered drains. Every house had its own bathing platform with a sophisticated wastewater system. They built on mounds of packed earth, lifting the city above the floodline like a ship riding the waves. And when archaeologists unearthed the so-called Great Bath, they realized it wasn't just a ritual space, it was part of a city-wide water management network, a balancing act between storing precious water and shedding its excess. What's striking is how these solutions weren't just practical, they were cultural. In Egypt, the annual Nile floods were so predictable they shaped the calendar. Temples and granaries were placed on the river's natural levees, just high enough to stay dry but close enough to the life-giving water. The Egyptians even had a god for the flood, Hapi, who symbolized both destruction and renewal. This wasn't fear of nature, it was a partnership. These civilizations didn't fight the water, they learned its rhythms, bent its power to their needs, and in doing so, laid the foundations of urban life itself. The legacy is everywhere, in the terraced fields of ancient China, the aqueducts of Rome, even the raised foundations of modern flood-prone cities. Because when your enemy isn't an army but the sky itself, you don't build fortresses, you build harmony. Mesopotamia's story begins with a paradox. The very rivers that gave life to the world's first cities could also destroy them in an instant. Each spring, snowmelt from distant mountains sent the Tigris and Euphrates surging over their banks, transforming fertile plains into swirling chaos. But instead of fleeing, the Sumerians did something revolutionary. They built upward. Their cities didn't just rise from the mud, they floated above it, perched on massive artificial platforms made of packed earth and rubble. Walk through the ruins of Ur today, and you'll notice something subtle but profound. The entire city sits on a man-made hill, a deliberate island in a seasonal sea. The ziggurat wasn't just a temple, it was the ultimate flood insurance. These towering stepped pyramids, like the famous Great Ziggurat of Ur, served as elevated refuges when the waters came. But their brilliance went deeper. The same bricks that formed their walls were carefully engineered, sun-dried mud mixed with reeds for flexibility, allowing the structure to shift slightly under water pressure without collapsing. And the temples at their summits, they weren't just spiritual centers but emergency storehouses, stocked with grain to feed displaced populations. Yet the real heroes were the unseen networks beneath the streets. Canals crisscrossed every Sumerian city like arteries, diverting floodwaters into controlled channels while providing irrigation during dry months. Archaeologists have found evidence of sluice gates, primitive but effective valves that could regulate flow with surprising precision. And along the riverbanks, levees made of woven reeds and compacted soil formed the first line of defense, constantly maintained by communal labor. This wasn't just engineering, it was a social contract. Every citizen had a role in maintaining the system, from farmer to king. What's astonishing is how these innovations mirrored the landscape itself. The Sumerians observed how natural levees formed where rivers deposited silt during smaller floods, and they replicated the process artificially. Their cities became microcosms of the floodplain, with elevated citadels mimicking high ground and lower districts designed to absorb water like sponges. Even their mythology reflected this balance. The god Enki wasn't just a deity of wisdom but of sweet waters, symbolizing the delicate interplay between harnessing rivers and respecting their power. The legacy of these flood-controlled cities echoes in surprising ways. Modern New Orleans uses pump systems inspired by ancient Mesopotamian gravity-fed canals. Amsterdam's raised polders owe a conceptual debt to Ur's platforms, and when engineers today design sponge cities in flood-prone regions of China, they're unknowingly channeling 4,000-year-old Sumerian wisdom. Because the greatest lesson from Mesopotamia isn't about holding back water, it's about learning to live with it, to shape a city that bends but doesn't break. While Mesopotamia built upward to escape floods, the cities of the Indus Valley took a radically different approach. They engineered water to flow through their streets like blood through veins. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa didn't just withstand floods, they harnessed them. Walk through these ruins today, and you'll find something astonishing beneath your feet. The world's first urban drainage network, a labyrinth of baked brick channels so advanced it wouldn't be matched until the Roman Empire 2,000 years later. Every house was a piece of this hydraulic puzzle. Step inside a typical residence, and you'd find a bathing platform with a sloped floor, its drain connected to a street-side gutter. These weren't crude holes in the ground, they had tapered brick linings to prevent clogging, and some even featured removable stone slabs for cleaning. Upstairs, terracotta pipes carried wastewater downward, avoiding contamination of living spaces, but the real genius lay outside. Streets were laid at perfect angles, their cambered surfaces funneling rainwater toward covered drains that ran beneath intersections. Archaeologists have found sediment traps at regular intervals, stone boxes that caught debris before it could block the system. The scale of coordination is staggering. In a city of 40,000 people, every block, every alley, every home adhered to this water choreography. Unlike Mesopotamia's reactive levees, the Indus system was proactive. Floods weren't just survived but anticipated. During monsoon seasons, excess water would flow through designated spillways into lower basins, creating temporary reservoirs for dry months. Even the bricks told a story. Standardized ratios 4:2:1 meant every component fit seamlessly, whether in a house wall or a sewer tunnel. This wasn't just engineering, it was a philosophy. Water wasn't an enemy to defeat but a force to guide. What's haunting is how this knowledge vanished. When Indus cities declined around 1900 BCE, their drainage secrets were buried for centuries. The Romans later reinvented similar systems, unaware that Bronze Age engineers had perfected them long before. Today, as modern cities from Mumbai to Miami struggle with floods, we're relearning Mohenjo-Daro's lessons. That resilience isn't about fighting nature's rhythms, but dancing with them. The Nile didn't just shape Egypt's agriculture, it dictated the very blueprint of its cities. Unlike Mesopotamia's battle against unpredictable floods, Egypt's challenge was precision. The Nile's annual rise was so reliable it became the backbone of their calendar, with 3 seasons: inundation, growth, and harvest. But this predictability didn't mean passivity. Egyptian engineers turned flooding into a science, designing cities that didn't just survive the water but thrived because of it. Look at the ruins of Thebes or Memphis, and you'll notice a pattern: temples, granaries, and palaces cling to the river's natural levees, those slight ridges where sediment deposited over millennia. These weren't random choices. The levees acted as natural flood barriers, high enough to stay dry during all but the worst inundations, yet close enough to the water for trade and irrigation. Meanwhile, farmland stretched across the floodplain below, divided into massive basins by earthen dikes. When the Nile rose, sluice gates would open, allowing water to cascade into these compartments, depositing nutrient-rich silt before draining away nature's perfect fertilizer delivery system. The genius lay in the scale. Entire regions were divided into hydraulic districts, each with its own network of canals and spillways, all maintained by local labor under the oversight of scribes. Records from Deir el-Medina, the workers' village near the Valley of the Kings, show how even ordinary citizens participated in dike repairs, a communal duty as vital as paying taxes. And when the floods receded, the trapped water in basins became a lifeline, evaporating slowly to extend the growing season. This wasn't just urban planning, it was a symbiotic dance with the river. Even Egypt's sacred architecture bowed to the Nile's rhythm. Temples like Karnak were built on raised platforms, their entrance ramps aligning with the flood's peak, symbolically bridging the human and divine as waters lapped at their bases. The god Hapi, depicted with pendulous breasts and a belly of offerings, embodied this duality, destruction and nourishment in one breath. Meanwhile, ordinary houses. They clustered on tells, artificial mounds of accumulated debris and rebuilt structures, growing higher over centuries like layers of flood-resistant armor. What's striking is what's missing. While other civilizations built towering walls against invaders, Egypt's early cities rarely bothered. The Nile was their moat, their highway, their calendar, and their larder. Why waste stone on fortifications when the river itself was the ultimate defense? Modern satellite imagery reveals ghostly outlines of ancient canals radiating from long-vanished settlements, proving how thoroughly water dictated urban life. Today, as Ethiopia's Grand Renaissance Dam alters the Nile's flow, these ancient adaptations feel newly relevant, because Egypt's cities didn't fight their river, they listened to it, and in that listening, built a civilization that endured for millennia. The Yellow River didn't earn its nickname China's Sorrow lightly. Unlike the predictable Nile, this river was a capricious force, swinging between life-giving bounty and catastrophic destruction without warning. One year, its waters would deposit fertile loess across the plains, creating the breadbasket of early Chinese civilization. The next, it might carve an entirely new path to the sea, swallowing cities whole in its wake. This wasn't just a challenge, it was an existential crisis that shaped China's earliest urban experiments. The Xia dynasty, often considered more legend than history, may hold the first clues to this watery battle. Ancient texts describe Yu the Great, a mythical engineer king who spent 13 years taming the floods not with walls but with channels. According to the stories, he dredged riverbeds, dug diversion canals, and even redirected tributaries, creating a network that turned destructive surges into controlled irrigation. While archaeologists debate Xia's existence, they've uncovered something remarkable along the Yellow River's ancient courses: layered cities built like geological strata. At the Erletu site, platforms of compacted earth rise in deliberate tiers, each layer representing a rebuild after another flood. These weren't haphazard repairs, they were calculated elevations, lifting the city incrementally like a cork on the tide. By the Shang dynasty, the engineering grew bolder. At Yingzhou, their last capital, excavations reveal something unexpected beneath the famous oracle bones: a sprawling underground drainage system of ceramic pipes and stone channels. But the real innovation lay above ground. Shang cities followed the nested walls principle, not concentric rings for defense, but staggered embankments designed to break flood momentum. The outermost earthworks stood lower, intentionally sacrificial to absorb the river's first fury, while inner walls grew progressively taller. It was a hydraulic chess game, sacrificing pawns to protect the king. What's fascinating is how agriculture mirrored urban design. Along the river's middle reaches, farmers sculpted hillsides into terraces long before they became iconic rice paddies. These stepped fields weren't just for planting, they were shock absorbers, slowing erosion during downpours while trapping nutrient-rich silt. Modern Lidar scans show how ancient villages clustered behind natural levees of accumulated sediment, their fields radiating in fractal-like patterns that maximized drainage. Even the Shang's legendary bronze workshops were strategically placed, not near palaces for prestige, but on high ground near clay deposits where flood risks were lowest. The shift came with the Zhou dynasty, when invaders from the steppes forced a grim calculation. Walls against men mattered more than walls against water. For centuries, China's sorrow had been the river, now it was human enemies. Yet the old wisdom never fully disappeared. When the Yellow River breached its banks in 70 BC, imperial engineers didn't build higher dikes. They revived Yu the Great's strategy, carving floodways to relieve pressure. Today, as China's megacities face rising waters from climate change, some planners are looking back. The Sponge City initiative in places like Shanghai uses permeable pavements and artificial wetlands, direct descendants of those ancient terraces and sacrificial embankments. Because the lesson written in Yellow River silt is clear: you can't stop the flood, but you can learn to let it pass through you. Rome's military might conquer continents, but there was one enemy even the legions couldn't defeat: the Tyber River. While history remembers Rome for its colosseums and conquests, the city's survival hinged on a quieter battle, keeping dry. The Cloaca Maxima, that marvel of ancient sewer engineering, gets all the glory, but Rome's flood defenses were far more nuanced. Imagine the Forum Romanum, the heart of the empire, submerged under waist-high water because it happened. Repeatedly, records tell of senators wading through flooded basilicas, of markets ruined by silt, even of drownings in the city center. This wasn't some neglected backwater. It was the capital of the world, brought to its knees by its own river. What's fascinating is how Rome's solutions mirrored its empire building, bold, systematic, and layered. Start with the roads. Those iconic cobbled streets weren't just for marching legions. Their cambered surfaces sloped rainwater into gutters that fed the Cloaca. But the real genius lay beneath. Archaeologists have found entire neighborhoods built on artificial filled, crushed pottery, rubble, even discarded marble, raising ground levels by meters over centuries. Walk through the Subura district today, and you're literally stepping on ancient Rome's flood insurance. And then there were the warehouses. The Horia Galbi, Rome's mega warehouse along the Tyber, stood on a massive raised platform with ventilated floors to keep grain dry. Conquerors might sack cities, but water, that demanded innovation. Yet for all its engineering, Rome never fully tamed the Tyber. The Campus Martius, that sprawling floodplain turned public space, was deliberately left undeveloped, a sacrificial zone where waters could spread harmlessly. Emperors like Augustus built monumental aqueducts not just for baths, but to divert flood-prone tributaries. Even the Pantheon's iconic steps hide a secret. They're actually a flood barrier, their height carefully calculated from centuries of inundation records. This was urban planning as dialogue with nature, where brute force gave way to calculated compromise. The lesson echoes today. Modern Rome still floods, proving that even empires must bow to rivers. But those ancient adaptations live on in unexpected ways. From New Orleans' raised foundations to Tokyo's underground flood tunnels. Because Rome's real legacy isn't just about conquering enemies, but about learning when to yield. For centuries, the Amazon was dismissed as a green desert too wet, too wild for complex civilizations to take root. But laser scans from above have revealed a startling truth: vast networks of mounds rising from the floodplains, arranged in precise geometric patterns. These weren't random hills, they were the foundations of floating metropolises, home to tens of thousands. Imagine canoeing through this watery world at its peak, raised neighborhoods connected by canals, orchards blooming on artificial islands, and plaza after plaza buzzing with activity, all perched above the annual deluge like a city on stilts. The secret lay in the soil itself. Archaeologists analyzing these mounds found something extraordinary: terra preta, or black earth. This wasn't natural dirt. It was engineered, a mix of charcoal, pottery shards, and compost that transformed poor rainforest soil into fertile gold. Generations of Amazonians built up these plots deliberately, layer by layer, creating elevated farmsteads that doubled as flood barriers. A single mound might hold fruit trees, medicinal plants, and even fish ponds in its depressions. A self-sustaining ecosystem where water was a partner, not a threat. What's revolutionary is how these cities functioned without walls or centralized rule. Unlike Mesopotamian ziggurats or Indus Valley citadels, Amazonian mounds spread organically across the landscape, connected by waterways rather than roads. At the Cuhacugu site in Brazil's Xingu region, researchers mapped over 20 interconnected settlements covering an area larger than Manhattan. Canals between mounds served as both transportation routes and fish farms, while causeways doubled as dams during high water. This wasn't urban sprawl, it was a fluid, adaptive network designed to flex with the river's moods. The real marvel, these cities thrived for centuries without destroying their environment. Modern satellite imagery shows how mound clusters align with natural flood patterns, avoiding erosion zones. Unlike today's concrete jungles, these were literal garden cities, where food grew on rooftops and waste became fertilizer instead of pollution. Even their disappearance holds lessons. When European diseases decimated populations, the forest swallowed the mounds within decades, leaving barely a trace. Now, as climate change forces us to rethink our own cities, these ancient blueprints offer a radical idea that the best flood defense might not be holding back water, but learning to rise with it. Venice's story begins with a paradox, a city built where no city should exist. Imagine the shock of early refugees fleeing invaders in the 5th century, arriving at these marshy lagoon islands and thinking, this is safe. No walls, no high ground, just shifting sandbars and tidal flats. Yet within centuries, this seeming death sentence became a masterclass in flood adaptation. Those iconic canals weren't built for gondolas, they were survival tools, carefully dredged to direct tidal flows and prevent the islands from dissolving into the Adriatic. Every aspect of Venice's layout whispers the same truth. This wasn't a city on water, it was a city negotiating with water. The foundation alone defies belief. Workers drove thousands of alder wood pilings waterlogged to resist rot deep into the soft silt, creating a submerged forest supporting limestone platforms. Modern engineers have found these pilings still intact after 1,000 years, their lignin hardened like concrete by mineral-rich seawater, but the real innovation was spatial. Unlike rigid grid cities, Venice's streets curve organically, following ancient riverbeds that were widened into canals. This wasn't whimsy, it allowed storm surges to dissipate energy in spirals rather than crashing inward. Even the bricks tell a story. Porous masonry paving stones let rainwater seep through to recharge the aquifer below, preventing destabilizing weight during floods. What's startling is what's missing. While medieval cities like Carcassonne raised towering walls, Venice's only defenses were its waterways. Attackers couldn't siege what they couldn't reach, galleys floundered in shallow channels, and invaders who disembarked found no purchase on the spongy ground. The lagoon itself was the fortress, its ever-shifting sandbars acting as natural moats. When Genoa attacked in 1380, Venetian sailors didn't meet them at sea. They lured enemies into trap channels where the tide stranded their ships. Yet Venice's brilliance lay in balance. The most tidal gates get attention today, but the city's medieval adaptations were subtler. At high tide, water still floods campy squares, but these sunken plazas were designed as temporary reservoirs, their drainage pipes calibrated to the moon's pull. Even the iconic Fondamenta sidewalks sloped gently into canals, turning rising water from a threat into a manageable rhythm. It's no accident that Venice's golden age coincided with its peak hydraulic mastery. When other cities fought floods, this one danced with them. Nowhere is this dialogue clearer than in the salt marshes. Venetians didn't drain these wetlands, they cultivated them, using tidal flows to farm fish and harvest salt. The very industry that funded Venice's empire depended on understanding water's ebb and flow. Today, as rising seas threaten the city, those ancient lessons resurface. Modern engineers study how medieval liddy sandbar islands were reinforced with woven willow to absorb wave energy, a technique now echoed in living shorelines from Louisiana to Bangladesh. Because Venice's real legacy isn't just stone and water, it's the radical idea that sometimes survival means yielding to the tide. Tenochtitlan rose from the lake like a mirage, a city of glittering canals and floating gardens where causeways stretched like fingers across the water. When Spanish conquistadors first saw it in 1519, they doubted their eyes. A metropolis larger than any in Europe, built not on solid ground but on a lake bed. The Aztecs hadn't just adapted to their watery world, they'd mastered it, turning what should have been a vulnerability into an unconquerable fortress. The secret lay in the chinampas, those legendary floating gardens that fed 200,000 people. But floating is a misnomer. These weren't rafts bobbing on waves, they were anchored plots of earth, painstakingly constructed from layers of mud, reeds, and willow roots. Imagine grids of fertile rectangles, each roughly 90 meters long, separated by canals just wide enough for a canoe. The genius was in the details. The willow roots knit the soil together, preventing erosion, while the canals between acted as both irrigation ditches and fish farms. Waste from the city became fertilizer, creating a closed-loop system where nothing was wasted. Farmers could harvest 7 crops a year from these plots, an agricultural output that dwarfed Europe's medieval fields. But the real marvel was how these gardens doubled as flood control. During rainy seasons, excess water would drain into the Chinampa canals, preventing the city from drowning. The Aztecs even engineered the lake itself, building dikes with removable gates to regulate water levels. The Albarradón of Nezahualcóyotl, a 15-kilometer dike, divided the freshwater side of Lake Texcoco from the brackish, protecting Chinampas from salt contamination. This wasn't just farming, it was landscape-scale hydrology. Then there were the causeways, 3 massive raised roads connecting the island city to shore. At first glance, they seem like simple bridges, but look closer. Each had gaps spanned by wooden drawbridges, turning them into defensive choke points. An invading army would find themselves funneled into narrow passages, exposed to arrows from canoes, with no way to retreat if the bridges were lifted. And beneath these roads, hidden channels allowed canoes to slip past undetected, ensuring the city could be resupplied even during siege. The Aztecs took isolation and weaponized it. While European cities huddled behind stone walls, Tenochtitlan's moat was the lake itself, too shallow for enemy ships, too deep for cavalry. When Cortés finally conquered the city, he didn't breach walls, he besieged it by cutting the aqueducts and blockading causeways, starving a civilization that had outsmarted floods for centuries. Today, as Mexico City sinks into the drained lakebed, engineers are reviving ancient techniques. Chinampa-style wetlands are being rebuilt to absorb rainwater, and canals are reappearing in neighborhoods where streets flood annually. The Aztecs knew something we're still learning. Sometimes the best way to conquer water is to invite it in. Anchor wasn't just a city, it was a vast machine built to dance with monsoons. At its height, this Khmer capital boasted reservoirs so massive they could hold billions of gallons, canals stretching hundreds of kilometers, and a hydraulic grid so precise it functioned like a liquid clockwork. But what's truly astonishing isn't the scale, it's the duality. Every ditch, every dike, every spillway served 2 masters, the gods and the floods. Take the West Barre, a rectangular reservoir stretching 8 kilometers long. On the surface, it was a lifeline storing water for dry seasons and irrigating rice paddies that fed 1 million people. But look deeper. Its orientation aligned with celestial events, its corners marking solstice sunrises. The Khmer didn't just build infrastructure, they encoded their cosmology into the landscape. Even the moats around temples like Angkor Wat weren't merely decorative. They acted as shock absorbers during downpours, their symmetrical basins redistributing floodwaters while symbolizing the Hindu ocean of creation. The genius lay in the gradients. Angkor's engineers sculpted the land into subtle terraces, allowing water to cascade from reservoir to canal to field in a controlled flow. At Phnom Kulen, the sacred mountain north of the city, they carved diversion channels into bedrock, stone sutures directing runoff away from vulnerable areas. And when excavations revealed buried spillways with adjustable stone gates, archaeologists realized the system wasn't static. Like a maestro conducting an orchestra, Angkor's waterkeepers could fine-tune the flow with seasonal precision. Yet for all its sophistication, the system had a fatal flaw. It assumed the monsoons would never change. Tree ring studies now show that during Angkor's decline in the 14th century, the region swung between brutal droughts and catastrophic deluges. Canals designed for steady rhythms choked on silt during dry spells, then overflowed when rains returned with a vengeance. The very reservoirs that once symbolized divine order became stagnant breeding grounds for malaria. What's haunting is how modern this story feels. Today's megacities, from Bangkok to Houston, face similar reckoning infrastructure built for yesterday's climate buckling under tomorrow's storms. Angkor's legacy isn't just about lost temples, it's a warning etched in water and stone. The difference between resilience and ruin often lies in designing for flexibility, not just scale. Because when the rains change their tune, even the grandest systems must learn to dance anew. The Netherlands didn't just settle on land, they invented it. Picture this, a vast, soggy delta where the Rhine, Meuse, and Scheldt rivers empty into the North Sea, a place more water than earth. For most civilizations, this would be a death sentence. But the Dutch saw opportunity in the marshes. Starting as early as the 9th century, they began a slow-motion revolution, not with swords but with shovels and wooden windmills. Their weapon of choice, the polder, a tract of land wrestled from the water's grip, inch by painstaking inch. The process was deceptively simple in theory, back-breaking in practice. First, workers dug a perimeter ditch around a flooded area, piling the dredged soil into a dike. Then came the windmills, dozens of them, their sails pumping water from the enclosed space into the ditch, which acted like a moat in reverse. As the water level inside dropped, the exposed sludge was mixed with straw and manure to create fertile soil. But here's the catch: the land sank as it dried, sometimes below sea level. Those windmills never stopped working. They became permanent guardians, pumping day and night to keep the new ground from reverting to swamp. What's astonishing is how these early polders mirrored natural processes. The Dutch noticed how tidal flats naturally accreted sediment during storms, so they recreated the phenomenon artificially, using woven willow mats to trap silt. By the 13th century, entire communities were organized around water boards, democratic councils that maintained dikes and drains. Forget kings and armies. Your social standing depended on how well you maintained your section of the communal dike. Neglect your duty, and you might face the water scout, a humiliating punishment where your house was publicly flooded until you paid your share. The real test came with the Beemster polder, drained in the early 17th century. This wasn't just farmland, it was a geometric masterpiece, divided into perfect rectangles by canals that doubled as transport routes. Engineers used celestial navigation to ensure the grid aligned with the cardinal directions, while windmills lifted water over dikes in stages, like a staircase for the sea. The Beemster became a blueprint, proving that human ingenuity could reshape nature itself. Yet the Dutch never truly conquered the water, they negotiated with it. Traditional farmhouses were built on mounds, their ground floors designed to flood harmlessly during breaches. Roads ran along dike tops, doubling as emergency barriers. Even today, as modern pumps replace windmills, the old wisdom lingers. When Rotterdam built its massive Meeslandkering storm surge barrier in the 1990s, they made one critical choice. it stays open most of the time, allowing the estuary to breathe. Because the deepest lesson of the polders isn't about domination, it's about knowing when to hold back the tide and when to let it in. Standing before Japan's mighty Heimji Castle, you'd be forgiven for assuming its sweeping moats were purely for defense. After all, what better way to stop an invading army than a wide expanse of water? But look closer. The moat's design tells a different story. Its curves follow the natural flow of nearby rivers, its depth calibrated not just to deter samurai, but to absorb monsoon rains. This was water management disguised as warfare, a brilliant duality that shaped Japan's feudal cities. Take Edo, modern-day Tokyo, where Tokugawa shoguns built a capital in a swamp. At first glance, the concentric moats around Edo Castle seem like classic fortifications, yet historical records reveal their true priority: flood control. The outer moat connected to the Sumida River, acting as a release valve during typhoons. Engineers even incorporated dobashi earth bridges that could be quickly dismantled when waters rose, transforming the castle grounds into an artificial island. Nearby neighborhoods followed suit, with merchant districts built on raised yashiki platforms, their alleys doubling as drainage channels during summer deluges. The genius lay in the hierarchy of water. Inner moats near the castle held clean water for drinking, while outer channels carried away waste, a sanitation system centuries ahead of its time. Towns like Kanazawa took it further, using castle moats to power water wheels for rice polishing, blending utility with security. Even the iconic Ishigaki stone walls served dual purposes. Their interlocking blocks resisted earthquakes while directing runoff into hidden culverts. What's striking is how these systems mirrored natural landscapes. Kyoto's Como River wasn't just a barrier, it was a living part of the city, its banks terraced with Suhama pebble beaches that slowed floodwaters. When archaeologists examined Osaka Castle's ruins, they found layers of oyster shells packed beneath the foundations, a natural filtration system that stabilized the soggy ground. This wasn't just engineering, it was biomimicry avant la lettre. The lesson endures in modern Japan. Tokyo's G-Cans project, a massive underground floodwater cathedral, echoes Edo's moat philosophy, using space creatively to manage water's ebb and flow. Because the shoguns understood something we're relearning today: the best defenses aren't against enemies, but against the elements themselves. When we picture the towering walls of ancient Babylon, our minds conjure images of armies clashing against impenetrable barriers. But what if we've been reading these structures all wrong? Those iconic fortifications, celebrated for repelling invaders, held a far more subtle and vital purpose. They were masterpieces of hydrological engineering. The Ishtar Gate's famed blue-glazed bricks weren't just for show. Their ceramic surfaces shed water like a duck's feathers, while the wall's core concealed layers of bitumen, a natural tar that acted as waterproofing. This wasn't just a wall, it was a sponge designed to absorb and redirect the Euphrates' unpredictable surges. Archaeologists digging along Babylon's perimeter found something revealing. The base of these so-called defensive walls sloped outward, a feature useless against battering rams but perfect for dissipating flood energy. Even the city's legendary moat served dual duty. While it could stall advancing troops, its true function was as a spillway, channeling excess water into reservoirs during the spring melt. Cuneiform tablets from Nebuchadnezzar's reign detail maintenance crews not for armories, but for dredging silt from these hydraulic networks. The oversight in modern interpretations becomes glaring when historians focus solely on war. They miss the quiet genius of cities that treated water, not warriors, as their greatest adversary. This misreading extends far beyond Babylon. Take the massive earthworks of Liangzhu in ancient China, long labeled as defensive ramparts. Recent soil analysis reveals their layers of packed clay and sand were precisely engineered to filter floodwaters, while their gaps aligned with natural drainage paths. Similarly, the fortress walls of Bronze Age Troy showed telltale signs of water management, perforated stones at their base that allowed controlled drainage, preventing buildup behind the barriers. Even medieval European towns like Bruges built their iconic walls with internal channels to relieve groundwater pressure, a feature later mistaken for secret escape tunnels. The irony is thick enough to stack bricks with. While scholars once imagined these walls as symbols of human conflict, their true legacy lies in cooperation with nature. Babylon's engineers knew a truth we're relearning today. The most enduring structures aren't those that stand against forces, but those that bend with them. Modern flood-prone cities from Venice to New Orleans now study these ancient designs, recognizing that the best defense isn't always a barrier. Sometimes it's a dance partner. Climate stability was the silent architect behind countless ancient cities. When weather patterns remained predictable for generations, urban planners could afford to focus on grandeur rather than survival. Look at the Minoan palaces of Crete, built during a balmy Mediterranean phase around 4,000 years ago. Their open-air courtyards and light wells celebrated sea breezes with barely a trace of flood defenses. But when tree rings and ice cores tell us the climate shifted, so did the blueprints. The same civilization that once prioritized elegant staircases suddenly built massive drainage channels at Knossos, their once graceful designs now interrupted by pragmatic slopes directing rainwater away from storerooms. The connection between paleoclimate data and city layouts becomes undeniable when you track the timelines. In Mesopotamia, sediment cores from the Persian Gulf reveal a catastrophic drought around 2200 BC, precisely when Ur's engineers switched from ornamental canals to deep reservoir construction. Over in the Andes, the Tiwanaku civilization thrived for centuries with simple irrigation ditches, until ice core evidence shows prolonged droughts hit around 1000 CE. Suddenly, their entire city redesign revolved around raised field agriculture and sunken gardens that trapped moisture like sponges. What's revelatory is how quickly these adaptations emerged. At Çatalhöyük in Turkey, archaeologists found an entire neighborhood rebuilt at a higher elevation within a single generation after flood layers appeared in the soil. No gradual evolution, just immediate collective action. Contrast this with Egypt's Old Kingdom, whose 5 centuries of stable Nile floods bred complacency. When drought finally came during the first intermediate period, their cities lacked even basic water storage. The lesson written in mud bricks and shifted foundations is clear. Climate wasn't just a backdrop for these civilizations, it was the director. Modern climate researchers have uncovered a pattern so consistent it's eerie. Using oxygen isotope data from cave stalagmites, they've matched the collapse of Cambodia's rain-dependent anchor with decades of erratic monsoons. Similarly, Maya city-states that flourished during wet periods abruptly built intricate cenote water systems when droughts arrived. Even Rome's infamous floods correlate with alpine glacier melt spikes recorded in ice cores. These weren't isolated events, they were urban survival strategies etched into stone by necessity. The takeaway reshapes how we view ancient ingenuity. Those ziggurats and reservoirs weren't just technical achievements. They were climate diaries, stone and clay records of humanity's eternal negotiation with an unpredictable sky. As today's cities face rising seas and megastorms, these old blueprints offer a sobering reminder. Civilization's greatest designs often emerge not during calm but crisis. Varanasi's stone gates cascade into the Ganges like a staircase for the gods, but look closer, and you'll see each step is a hydrological masterpiece. These sacred riverside platforms, where pilgrims bathe in holy waters, are precisely angled to break the current during monsoon floods, their interlocking stones channeling destructive energy into gentle ripples. The same stairway that welcomes devotees at dawn becomes a shock absorber when the river swells, its design echoing the fractal patterns of Hindu cosmology. This wasn't just architecture, it was a prayer in stone where spirituality and survival flowed together. High in the Andes, Machu Picchu's temples tell a similar story. The Inca didn't just carve terraces for crops, they engineered them as a massive water filtration system. Each agricultural level acted like a sieve, with gravel-filled drainage channels running beneath sacred structures. During heavy rains, water would percolate through the soil, purified by the stone layers before emerging in ceremonial fountains. The famed Temple of the Condor, with its wing-like rock formations, secretly functioned as a spillway, diverting runoff away from critical areas. Every spiritual symbol doubled as flood infrastructure, blending worship with watershed management. This fusion of sacred geometry and hydrology appears across continents. In Cambodia, Angkor's temple moats mirrored the Hindu cosmic ocean, but their precise dimensions created hydraulic gradients that prevented stagnation and malaria. Egypt's Temple of Kham Amba was built with twin sanctuaries, one for the crocodile god Sobek and another for falcon-headed Horus, but its hidden genius lay in the nilometer carved into its walls, a sacred measuring device that doubled as a flood early warning system. Even the labyrinthine tunnels beneath Malta's Hal Saflieni hypogeum, a 4,000-year-old burial site, whisper of hydrological wisdom. Their serpentine passages regulate humidity to preserve fragile limestone carvings from water damage. The pattern reveals a profound truth. Ancient cultures saw water as more than a physical force, it was a divine dialogue. When Mayan engineers aligned their cenotes with celestial events, they weren't just building wells but creating cosmic mirrors where rainwater reflected the stars. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia, often described as stairways to heaven, also functioned as elevated flood sanctuaries, their tiers symbolizing the layers of creation while physically rising above disaster. In these designs, the sacred and the practical weren't opposing ideas but two currents in the same river. Modern engineers are now decoding this spiritual pragmatism. Studies of Varanasi's ghats show their curved profiles reduce hydrodynamic pressure by up to 30%, a principle now used in modern flood barriers. Machu Picchu's drainage techniques inspire green roofs in cities like Chicago, where layered soils mimic Inca terraces. As climate change forces us to rethink resilience, these ancient blueprints offer more than nostalgia. They reveal a worldview where honoring nature's power wasn't just poetry, but the smartest survival strategy ever devised. Petra's rose-red cliffs conceal a cruel irony. This desert city, carved into drought-resistant rock, ultimately met its demise not from thirst but from drowning. The Nabateans who built this wonder were master hydrologists, channeling scarce rainwater through intricate terracotta pipes and cliffside dams. Yet sediment layers tell a violent story. Around 100 CE, a catastrophic flash flood tore through the city's narrow entrance gorge, scouring away entire neighborhoods. The very slot canyon that made Petra defensible became its death trap when an unprecedented downpour funneled torrents through its stone throat. Up in North America, Cahokia's fate echoes this paradox. The Mississippian culture that built this sprawling metropolis home to 20,000 at its peak designed their Grand Plaza as a subtle drainage basin, sloping gently toward wood-lined canals. But soil cores reveal a darker timeline. Around 1200 CE, the Mississippi River began surging beyond historic patterns, possibly due to deforestation upstream. Cahokia's carefully layered mounds, designed to stay dry during typical floods, became islands in a relentless inland sea. Archaeologists find abandoned house posts cut abruptly at the 6-foot mark, the height where water finally defeated human perseverance. What makes these failures so instructive is their context. Petra's engineers had successfully managed flash floods for centuries using diversion walls and underground cisterns. Cahokia's builders understood river dynamics well enough to align their city with celestial events tied to flood cycles. These weren't naive settlements, they were hydraulic civilizations at their zenith. Their downfalls expose a harsh truth: ancient engineering had limits defined by climate memory. When rainfall patterns shifted beyond lived experience, when rivers rewrote their own rules, even the most brilliant adaptations could become obsolete overnight. Modern climate science sheds light on these collapses. Petra's disaster layer coincides with Mediterranean tree ring records showing freak storms during the Roman warm period. Cahokia's decline aligns with sediment studies proving the Mississippi's flow doubled during the medieval climate anomaly. These cities didn't fail from poor design, they were out-engineered by a climate system entering uncharted territory. Their ruins stand as stone warnings. Resilience isn't about conquering nature's patterns, but preparing for their mutability. Yet within these tragedies lies an unexpected hopefulness. At Petra, later Nabateans rebuilt their diversion walls higher, incorporating limestone baffles to dissipate flood energy, adaptations still studied by Jordanian engineers today. Cahokia's survivors migrated to higher ground, taking their mound-building knowledge to new flood-resistant settlements. Their legacies teach us that collapse isn't always an end, but sometimes a brutal lesson in redesign. As today's cities face rising seas and superstorms, these ancient failures may yet become our most valuable teachers. Long before modern engineers drafted blueprints, indigenous cultures had already cracked the code of sustainable water management, with solutions so elegant they seem plucked from science fiction. Take the Brewerina fish traps in Australia, a labyrinth of stone walls stretching nearly half a kilometer across the Barwon River. At first glance, they resemble an abstract mosaic, but watch the water flow and the genius reveals itself. Each curved wall acts like a living filter, guiding fish into woven traps during high tide while allowing smaller species to slip through. A self-regulating harvest system that fed generations without depleting stocks. The Ongjemba people didn't just build these structures, they encoded lunar cycles and fish behavior into the stones, creating a calendar of plenty that balanced human needs with ecological limits. Cross the Pacific to the Yucatan Peninsula, where the Maya turned sinkholes into masterpieces of hydrology. Cenotes weren't just water sources, they were interconnected nodes in a vast underground network. By charting cave systems that stretched for miles, engineers could predict how rainfall would percolate through limestone, directing runoff to replenish reservoirs like Tikol's towering aguadas. But the real innovation lay in the sacred choltons, bottle-shaped cisterns lined with plaster so precise it repelled algae. Modern tests show their plaster mix, infused with tree sap and crushed shells, naturally purified water for months, a biotechnology breakthrough we're only now replicating with nanofilters. In the Andes, the Huari people's Amunas system reads like a love letter to watersheds. Instead of fighting mountain runoff, they slowed it by carving zigzag channels into hillsides, mimicking the veins of a leaf. Water that might have eroded valleys instead seeped into sponge-like terraces, recharging springs during dry seasons. Today, Lima, a city so parched it gets less rain than Cairo, is reviving these ancient techniques to combat drought, proving that pre-colonial wisdom flows as powerfully as ever. What unites these innovations is their radical humility. Unlike concrete dams that force rivers into submission, indigenous designs worked with water's natural rhythms. When Dutch engineers recently studied Brewerina's traps, they found the curved walls reduced turbulence by 40%, a principle now used in modern fish ladders. Maya cenote maps are helping hydrologists locate new freshwater reserves in Mexico's drought-stricken north. Even the word sustainability feels inadequate for systems that thrived for millennia without fossil fuels or pumps. The tragedy is how much was nearly lost. Colonial accounts dismissed these feats as primitive, paving over aqueducts and damming sacred rivers. But as climate change exposes the fragility of our concrete jungles, that suppressed knowledge is resurfacing, not as nostalgia, but as necessity. From Arizona's desert farmers adopting Zuni runoff harvesting to Bangalore's lakes being restored using traditional Khmer designs, the past isn't just whispering, it's offering a lifeline. Because when your ancestors spent 10,000 years perfecting harmony with water, their blueprints might just save us all. Medieval Europe's cities rose from the ashes of Rome's collapse with a dangerous blind spot. They forgot how to dance with floods. While ancient engineers had spent millennia perfecting the art of water management, many medieval towns built with breathtaking audacity right in the floodplains, their foundations sinking into the same silt that had drowned their predecessors. The consequences were as predictable as they were tragic. Chronicles from London to Cologne tell of streets transformed into rivers, cellars swallowing families whole, and plagues bubbling up from waterlogged graveyards. This wasn't just bad luck, it was a staggering loss of collective memory. The roots of this amnesia run deep. When Roman aqueducts crumbled and their drainage experts vanished, so too did the hard-won knowledge of gradients and spillways. Monasteries, the new centers of learning, focused on theology over hydrology. A 9th century manuscript from St. Gall in Switzerland meticulously diagrams wine cellars and scriptoriums, but nowhere does it mention how to keep them dry. Meanwhile, the very layout of medieval cities worked against survival. Unlike Rome's deliberate terracing or Mesopotamia's raised platforms, towns like Bruges and Ghent grew organically along rivers, their crooked alleys funneling floodwaters into deadly channels. The same trade routes that brought wealth also carried disaster. Ships needed docks, docks needed low banks, and low banks invited catastrophe. Nowhere was this folly clearer than in Venice's shadow. While the lagoon city mastered its watery world, mainland neighbors like Ravenna ignored the lessons. By the 12th century, Ravenna's once grand Roman canals had clogged with neglect, its streets sinking below the rising water table. When the Po River burst its banks in 1180, the flood didn't just damage buildings, it erased entire neighborhoods, their foundations liquefying like sugar in tea. Archaeologists now find medieval wells dug straight through Roman sewer lines, proving later generations didn't just forget the old systems, they didn't even recognize them. The cost of this ignorance mounted with each generation. London's medieval Fleet Ditch, originally a Roman-engineered storm channel, became an open sewer before clogging entirely, turning into a stinking morass that overflowed with every high tide. In Paris, the Seine's floods grew so frequent they were given names like the Great Water of 1420, yet the city kept expanding onto newly drained islands, only to see them vanish under the next deluge. Even the mighty cathedral builders couldn't solve the problem. The crypt of Canterbury Cathedral flooded annually until someone rediscovered Roman drain tiles beneath the floor in the 1950s. Yet within this bleak pattern glimmered exceptions, pockets where ancient wisdom survived. Moorish engineers in Spain preserved Roman hydraulic techniques, their acequias channeling mountain snowmelt to arid fields. In the Low Countries, farmers revived a trick even older than Rome, building dwelling mounds called turpen, artificial hills that rose like islands from the marsh. And when the Black Death emptied cities, some survivors finally listened to the land. After the plague, Florence's leaders commissioned surveys of ancient Roman drains, a glimmer of the Renaissance's rediscovery not just of art but of practical wisdom. The lesson etched into these water-stained stones is uncomfortably modern. Just as medieval Europe dismissed Roman hydraulics as pagan relics, we've often treated indigenous and ancient flood strategies as primitive curiosities. But as climate change rewrites rainfall patterns, those old blueprints are gaining new urgency. From Dutch engineers studying Turpin for sea level rise to London's supersewer project rediscovering lost Roman gradients, the past isn't just history, it's the next survival manual. Because civilizations that forget their floods are doomed to drown in them. High in Bali's volcanic hills, a network of stone shrines hides in plain sight, not dedicated to gods of war or harvest, but to water itself. These are the Sabak temples, the silent orchestrators of one of history's most sophisticated flood-proof landscapes. Picture this: every rice terrace, every canal, every sluice gate across entire watersheds wasn't just engineered, it was blessed. Farmers didn't merely share water, they gathered in temple courtyards to debate flow rates like sacred liturgy, balancing ecological needs with spiritual duty. This wasn't irrigation, it was liquid democracy. The system's brilliance lay in its scale. Unlike top-down Roman aqueducts or pharaoh-controlled Nile channels, Sabak was hyperlocal yet perfectly synchronized. Each temple governed a micro-watershed, its priests acting as both hydrologists and mediators. During dry seasons, they'd allocate water shifts down to the hour, ensuring upstream farms didn't hoard while downstream fields withered. When monsoons came, the same canals that fed paddies became spillways. Their gates opened ceremonially to send excess water cascading through ritual pathways. Archaeologists studying sediment layers found something remarkable. These terraces experienced fewer catastrophic floods than modern industrial farms, despite heavier rainfall. The secret: Sabak's canals mimicked fractal patterns found in natural river systems, dispersing energy rather than resisting it. But the true marvel was the social engineering. Sabak's water shares were tied not to land ownership but to labor investment. Maintain a section of canal, you earned more irrigation time. Neglect your duties. The temple redistributed your water rights. Disputes were settled not in courts but in temple assemblies, where offenders faced spiritual sanctions. Being barred from ceremonies often proved more effective than fines. Even the rice varieties were part of the system. Farmers planted staggered harvests across terraces, creating a mosaic of growth stages that stabilized the water table. Modern hydrologists are still unraveling Sabak's secrets. When satellite imagery mapped Bali's watersheds, they discovered temple placements aligned with geological fault lines, spots where groundwater naturally resurged. The terraces themselves acted as massive filtration beds, their layered soils removing pollutants before water reached streams. And in a stroke of biomimicry, the alternating wet-dry cycles in paddies suppressed pests without pesticides, creating self-regulating ecosystems. What's heartbreaking is how close this wisdom came to vanishing. In the 1970s, Indonesia's Green Revolution pushed chemical fertilizers and deep well pumps, bypassing Sabak's delicate balance. The result: wells ran dry, rivers silted up, and floods increased. But in a twist of irony, Bali's tourism boom saved the system, not out of nostalgia, but because engineers realized resort areas relying on bottled water needed Sabak springs to recharge. Today, UNESCO-protected Sabak isn't just a relic, it's a living laboratory. From California's drought-stricken farms to Bangladesh's floodplains, agronomists are adapting its principles, proving that sometimes the most advanced solutions were moss-covered stone and whispered prayers. Beneath the sun-baked plains of Persia, a hidden network of veins kept cities alive, not with blood but with water. The Qanat system, perfected over 2,000 years ago, wasn't just irrigation. It was a subterranean masterpiece of flood prevention. Picture this: workers digging vertical shafts deep into alluvial fans, then connecting them with gently sloping tunnels that tapped groundwater without disturbing the surface. The genius: these tunnels acted like pressure valves during flash floods. When rare downpours struck the mountains, excess water would seep into the Qanat shafts instead of surging destructively across the plain. The same system that delivered life-giving water in droughts also silently siphoned away its deadly excess. Teotihuacan's engineers took underground water management even further. Walk the Avenue of the Dead today, and you're strolling atop a hidden labyrinth. Beneath those massive pyramids lies a web of stone-lined channels that did triple duty, draining stormwater, distributing clean water to neighborhoods, and even regulating the city's microclimate. Archaeologists found something astonishing where these channels intersect: carefully placed volcanic rocks that created vortexes, slowing water flow to prevent erosion during heavy rains. This wasn't just plumbing, it was fluid dynamics encoded in stone. The real surprise comes when you compare these systems. Persian Qanats spread water horizontally across vast distances, while Teotihuacan's channels focused on vertical control, channeling water downward to prevent the city's artificial lake from overflowing. Yet both shared a profound understanding of terrain. Qanat builders used simple wooden levels called mizan to calculate slopes of just 1 degree, enough to keep water moving without causing collapses. Teotihuacan's planners aligned their channels with celestial events, creating a hydraulic calendar where water levels predicted seasonal floods. Modern hydrologists are still unpacking their secrets. In Oman, where Qanats still function, thermal imaging shows how the tunnel's spiral air shafts create natural cooling, a passive AC system that also prevented evaporation. At Teotihuacan, engineers replicating the ancient channels found their trapezoidal shape reduces turbulence by 40% compared to modern rectangular pipes. Even the mortar tells a story, mixed with cactus sap in Mexico and egg whites in Persia, both creating self-healing properties when cracks formed. What's haunting is how these technologies vanished. When Spanish conquistadors filled Teotihuacan's channels, they unknowingly doomed Mexico City to centuries of floods. And when diesel pumps replaced Qanats in Iran, water tables plummeted. Now, as megadroughts grip both regions, there's a desperate scramble to revive these ancient systems. In Yazd, engineers are cleaning centuries-old Qanat shafts to combat desertification, while Mexico City is excavating Teotihuacan's principles for its flood-prone metro. The lesson rings clear: sometimes the most advanced solution isn't the newest, it's the one that worked for 2,000 years. Houston's concrete sprawl and Mohenjo-Daro's baked brick grid might seem worlds apart, but their fates are bound by the same watery thread. In 2017, Hurricane Harvey dumped 60 trillion gallons on southeast Texas, enough to fill every swimming pool in America 7 times over. The floodwaters didn't just overwhelm Houston, they exposed a modern arrogance. While developers paved over prairie land that once absorbed rainfall like a sponge 4,000 years earlier, Mohenjo-Daro's engineers were designing neighborhoods with percolation pits, layers of sand and gravel beneath streets that let water seep downward instead of pooling. The difference: one civilization treated the land as a partner, the other as a blank slate. The parallels run deeper than drainage. Houston's unchecked expansion into the Katy Prairie, a natural floodplain, mirrors the very mistakes that drowned ancient Cahokia. Both cities sacrificed their natural shock absorbers for short-term growth. But where Cahokia's leaders lacked hydrological records, Houston's planners ignored them. Historical maps from the 1940s show bayous wide enough to handle storms, but decades of narrowing these channels for real estate left the city defenseless. Meanwhile, Mohenjo-Daro's engineers did the opposite. They widened their main drainage corridor over time, excavating deeper channels as sedimentation demanded. Their city thrived for 700 years. Houston's floods now cost billions annually. What's haunting is how selectively we've remembered the past. Modern engineers praise Mohenjo-Daro's covered drains but replicate only their appearance, not their philosophy. The ancient city's sewer grates weren't just filters. They were part of a decentralized system where every household managed its own wastewater before it entered public channels. Contrast this with Houston's reliance on massive centralized detention basins, single points of failure during Harvey, when power outages disabled pumps. Even the materials tell a story. Mohenjo-Daro's bitumen-sealed bricks resisted erosion for millennia, while Houston's concrete culverts crumble in decades under saltwater corrosion. Yet glimmers of ancient wisdom are resurfacing. After Harvey, some Houston neighborhoods began adopting sponge city principles, permeable pavements, rain gardens, and strategic land buyouts to restore floodplains. These aren't innovations but rediscoveries, the same techniques Mesopotamian farmers used to create self-draining fields. The difference now is scale. While Mohenjo-Daro's entire layout honored water's flow, modern cities retrofit solutions piecemeal, treating symptoms rather than redesigning the system. The lesson isn't about abandoning progress but redefining it. When Taipei faced similar floods, it didn't just build higher walls, it studied ancient Liangzhu cities' hydraulic grids, combining them with modern sensors to create adaptive floodgates. Houston could look to the same past it's built over, because history's warnings are written in silt and soaked drywall. Civilizations that ignore their floodplains don't just get wetter, they unravel. Archaeology's quiet revolution isn't happening with shovels and brushes anymore. It's unfolding in laser scans and soil cores. Take the jungles of Cambodia, where Lidar peeled back the canopy to reveal Angkor's hidden hydraulic grid. Thousands of miles of canals and reservoirs that turned the city into a giant water processor. These weren't just ditches, their precise elevations formed a gravitational ballet, directing monsoon rains away from temples while replenishing aquifers. For centuries, historians assumed Angkor's collapse came from invasion. Now, sediment analysis tells a different story, layers of choked silt in those same canals, evidence of a civilization overwhelmed not by swords, but by climate shifts it couldn't adapt to. Soil chemistry is rewriting city biographies too. In the ruins of Çatalhöyük, one of humanity's first urban experiments, researchers found something unexpected in the mud bricks, deliberate layers of crushed shells and gravel. At first glance, it looked like filler until hydraulic testing showed these additives created microscopic drainage channels, letting walls breathe during floods while preventing catastrophic erosion. Modern engineers call this capillary break technology. Neolithic builders achieved it with seashells and intuition. Even more startling, the same principle appears in Maya plaster mixes and Roman concrete separated by millennia, united by water wisdom. The real game changer is how these tools expose our blind spots. For generations, archaeologists mapped cities by visible walls and gates. But ground-penetrating radar at Turkey's Hittite capital Hattusa revealed something radical beneath the famed Lion Gates lay a network of subterranean spillways, their limestone channels precisely angled to divert flash floods under the city. The Hittites didn't just build fortresses, They engineered entire landscapes to vanish floodwaters like magic. Perhaps the most humbling discoveries come from failed adaptations. In the American Southwest, researchers using drone-mounted thermal cameras spotted ancient Puebloan check dams, small stone walls across arroyos that most had dismissed as livestock pens. Soil moisture sensors proved their true purpose, slowing desert downpours just enough to let water sink into farmable terraces instead of washing away. These weren't crude attempts. They were calibrated systems that worked for centuries until megadroughts exceeded their design limits. Their collapse wasn't ignorance, it was climate change outpacing human ingenuity. What emerges from these high-tech excavations is a paradigm shift. Civilization's hallmark wasn't just writing or monuments, it was the collective genius to turn water from destroyer into ally. When Lidar exposes Mississippi mound cities aligned with ancient river channels, or soil analysis proves Dutch polder techniques existed in pre-Inca Peru, we're not just correcting history, we're recovering a lost philosophy. The real wonder isn't how much they knew, but how they knew it without satellites or computers reading landscapes like sacred texts, writing their solutions in stone and silt. Now, as our own cities face rising waters, these rediscovered blueprints offer more than curiosity. They hold survival clues coded in the dirt beneath our feet. Future cities might not rise on steel and glass alone. They could be built on lessons carved in silt and stone. As sea levels creep upward and storms grow fiercer, urban planners are turning to an unlikely source of wisdom: civilizations that thrived for centuries in flood-prone landscapes. The concept of sponge cities sweeping through modern urban design isn't a new idea, it's a revival. Ancient Mohenjo-Daro's permeable streets, Liangzhu's terraced floodplains, and Bali's Subak irrigation networks are being studied not as relics, but as blueprints for survival. Take Shanghai's ambitious Sponge City initiative, where engineers are replacing concrete pavements with porous materials that mimic Mesopotamian brickwork, allowing rainwater to seep into aquifers instead of overwhelming drains. Or Copenhagen's cloudburst parks, designed to absorb sudden downpours like the sunken plazas of medieval Venice. Even New York's Big U project, a protective ribbon around Lower Manhattan, draws inspiration from the Netherlands' ancient polder system, using landscaped berms to slow storm surges rather than fight them. These aren't nostalgic gestures, they're strategic adaptations of proven technologies. The shift goes beyond infrastructure. It's a fundamental rethinking of urban relationships with water. Where modern cities often treat floods as emergencies to be conquered, ancient cultures viewed them as rhythms to be choreographed. China's Liangzhu city, built over 5,000 years ago, elevated its ceremonial centers on earthen platforms while letting surrounding fields flood seasonally, a dynamic balance now echoed in Rotterdam's floating neighborhoods. Similarly, Jakarta's planners are studying the Nabateans' desert flood channels to combat their sinking crisis, recognizing that sometimes the most advanced solution is one that's already weathered millennia. What's revolutionary is how these ancient strategies outperform modern brute force engineering. Tokyo's underground flood tunnels, colossal as they are, can't match the efficiency of Teotihuacan's stone-lined dissipation channels. Philadelphia's green infrastructure program, which redirects stormwater into planted basins, works on the same principle as Maya cenotes, harnessing natural filtration rather than mechanical pumps. Even something as simple as angled street gutters, a technique perfected in Varanassi's Ghats, is now reducing flood damage in Miami Beach by 30%. Yet the greatest lesson isn't technical, it's philosophical. Ancient cities thrived by observing and adapting to their environments, not dominating them. The Dutch, who once prided themselves on forcing back the sea with dikes, are now embracing living with water strategies inspired by turpan mounds. In Bangkok, architects are reviving Ayutthaya's stilt house traditions for new flood-resistant homes. And when Boston redesigned its waterfront, it looked to Zuni Pueblo designs that harmonize with seasonal flows rather than resist them. This isn't about abandoning modern innovation, it's about augmenting it with time-tested wisdom. Smart sensors in Amsterdam's canals now work alongside restored medieval spillways. Singapore's high-tech marina barrage integrates tidal gates with mangrove wetlands, blending Angkor's reservoir principles with 21st-century materials. The cities of tomorrow won't choose between past and future. They'll fuse them, creating urban landscapes where ancient hydrological genius meets AI-driven climate models. The urgency couldn't be clearer. With 80% of coastal cities at risk by 2050, we're in a race against rising waters, but the antidote to anxiety might lie in archaeology. When planners in New Orleans studied Cahokia's mound building techniques, they realized elevated foundations alone weren't enough. The real magic was in community-wide participation, a lesson now shaping Louisiana's resettlement programs. Similarly, Chennai's revival of ancient stepwells isn't just storing water. It's rebuilding a cultural connection to conservation that colonialism erased. Perhaps the most hopeful sign is how these ideas are spreading. From Nairobi's adoption of Maasai floodplain management to Barcelona's use of Roman cistern logic in its superblocks, a global movement is recognizing that resilience isn't just about stronger walls, but smarter relationships with water. The future of urban survival may depend on something simple, remembering what our ancestors never forgot. Conquerors quickly learned a brutal truth: you can burn a city, enslave its people, and melt its gold, but destroying its water systems is suicide. When the Mongols swept through 13th century China, they left pyramids of skulls in their wake, yet Kublai Khan's engineers meticulously preserved the Duzhongyan irrigation system, a 2,000-year-old network of levees and channels that fed Sichuan's rice bowls. This wasn't mercy, it was cold calculation. A sacked city could be repopulated in years, but a shattered hydraulic system might take centuries to rebuild, if ever. The same conquerors who leveled Baghdad's libraries recognized that water infrastructure was too precious to lose, a lifeline even victory couldn't replace. Spanish conquistadors in the Andes made the same pragmatic choice, though grudgingly. After toppling the Inca Empire, they encountered terraces so precisely engineered they could grow crops on near vertical slopes, fed by stone aqueducts that defied earthquakes. Rather than dismantling these marvels, the invaders grafted Catholic chapels onto Inca shrines built at key canal junctions, co-opting both faith and flow. Colonial records from Cusco reveal a telling detail. Spanish landowners paid Inca engineers triple wages to maintain the system, their knowledge too vital to discard. Even as they melted sacred gold, the conquerors kept the water running. This pattern repeats across continents and eras. When the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman captured Budapest in 1541, his first decree wasn't about taxes or religion. It ordered the restoration of the Roman aqueducts the Hungarians had neglected. In Mesopotamia, successive empires from the Babylonians to the Parthians rebuilt the same silt-clogged canals century after century, each new ruler inheriting the responsibility like a sacred trust. The Assyrians, infamous for impaling rebels, left detailed manuals on maintaining Qanats Persia's underground tunnels because even tyrants need drinking water. What's revealing is how rarely this pragmatism extended to other infrastructure. Palaces were routinely demolished to build new ones in conquerors' preferred styles, but water temples like Bali's Subak shrines remained untouched. Armies looted granaries but maintained the irrigation channels that filled them. The great irony, many of these preserved systems outlasted the empires that spared them. The Dujongyan scheme still waters Sichuan's fields today, while the Spanish colonial haciendas that relied on Inca canals crumbled long ago. The exceptions prove the rule. When the Mongols finally did destroy a water system, breaking Baghdad's Narawan Canal during their 13th century siege, the consequences were apocalyptic. Farmland reverted to desert, triggering famines that killed more than the sword. Centuries later, British colonialists in India dismissed local tank systems as primitive, only to watch droughts devastate regions that had flourished for millennia. These weren't just failures of empathy, they were failures of foresight, proving that even the mightiest conquerors ignore water wisdom at their peril. Modern conflicts continue this uneasy dance. Satellite imagery shows both ISIS and Syrian government forces carefully avoiding damage to ancient Roman aqueducts in their battles, while Ukraine's war has seen deliberate attacks on Soviet-era dams, a terrifying escalation in hydrological warfare. The unspoken rule endures: destroy a people's monuments and they may rebuild, destroy their water and you destroy their future. Perhaps that's the ultimate lesson etched in these ancient channels, that survival, not conquest, is the real measure of power. Ancient cities stand as silent mentors in our current climate crisis, their stones etched with hard-won lessons we've somehow forgotten. These weren't just settlements that survived floods, they were civilizations that evolved alongside them, treating water not as an enemy to vanquish but as a partner to understand. The winding streets of Venice, the terraced grids of Mohenjo-Daro, the elevated mounds of Cahokia, each layout whispers the same truth. Resilience isn't about brute force, but about bending without breaking. Today, as rising seas and superstorms rewrite our coastlines, their blueprints offer more than historical curiosity. They hold urgent survival strategies. Consider the paradox of modern engineering. We've built higher dams and longer seawalls, yet flood damage costs soar yearly. Meanwhile, Bali's Subak temples, where farmers managed water through spiritual consensus, kept harvests flowing for 1,000 years without a single pump. The difference isn't technology, it's philosophy. Ancient cultures viewed water as a thread woven through every aspect of life: agriculture, architecture, even worship. When the Nabateans carved Petra's cliffside channels, they weren't just moving liquid, they were encoding generations of flood memory into stone. Their systems didn't resist nature's rhythms, they harmonized with them. The warning in these ruins is unmistakable. Angkor's sprawling reservoirs, once the pride of the Khmer Empire, now lie choked with silt, a testament to what happens when even the grandest systems ignore changing climates. Yet within that caution lies hope. From the Netherlands' revival of medieval Turpan mounds to China's sponge cities mimicking Liangzhu's ancient floodplains, we're finally relearning these old wisdoms. The most groundbreaking ideas aren't always the newest sometimes. They're the ones that have been quietly working for millennia. What makes these ancient solutions so vital now isn't just their engineering, but their adaptability. The Maya didn't just build cenotes, they adapted them into drought-proof ladders by lining them with bee wax to preserve food. The Aztecs didn't merely tolerate their lake-bed home, they turned it into a floating fortress of chinampas that fed an empire. These weren't static designs but living systems, tweaked across generations like a conversation with the landscape. Modern cities could learn from that patience. From Mumbai's monsoon floods to Miami's king tides, our solutions often lack the humility to evolve. The invitation in these ruins is clear: to stop seeing water as a problem to fix and start recognizing it as a force to collaborate with. When New York's Big U project incorporated Dutch polder logic, or when Chennai revived ancient stepwells to combat drought, they weren't looking backward, they were thinking ahead. The most radical idea these ancient cities offer isn't a specific technique, but a mindset. That survival isn't about conquering nature, but about listening to it. As the climate clock ticks louder, their stones speak with growing urgency, not as relics of the past, but as guides to whatever future we're brave enough to build.